Hello, my name is Jeffrey Milanich, and I am a senior IAM engineer with Instrumental Identity, and I'm here to talk about aggregating users from a non-user-centric data source. In this case, it's going to be a web service direct connector. First, a little bit about us at Instrumental Identity. We are a SailPoint partner and consultant that works with a variety of clients to help them achieve their identity goals. Some of the things that brought about this presentation that we've run into with the clients is we've encountered some non-standard data sources in their systems or requirements to use a subset of data that was not available from a direct user endpoint on the web services. So let's define a little bit about the differences between what we mean with user-centric and non-user-centric. User-centric is going to have the user as the base of the calls, and you'll build out the details of the user account from there. Any subsequent calls to get additional data will use the ID of that initial user to get this data for them. In a non-user-centric system, another field, such as a folder or group, is going to be the entry point to getting the user data, and then from there, each of those folders or groups may have the users on them. So that's what we mean by non-user-centric, is that at the center of the calls is going to be something other than the specific user. All right, just briefly, I wanted to touch on the web service direct connector that we're using here. It allows ISC to connect to REST endpoints. From there, you can build account or entitlement objects from the details. And the web service direct connector does require that the data come in a user-centric format with all of the user accounts being returned on the initial HTTP operation. So what does this look like in the standard web service? So if you were going to make a call to a user-centric data source, you would have your first call be to the get users. So you would get the users and come back. And then if there's additional data that you need to get for the user, you would add a second and or a third HTTP operation. And as shown here, we have one that's called get user details, and that goes out to the user detail endpoint and brings back the data. And then we have one for get permissions, and then that brings back the data. So if you end up encountering a non-user-centric data source, most people would look at this and say, oh, I can solve that. I will just put the folders request in front of the user's request. So as you can see here, this was the first attempt that I did when I encountered this. I said, okay, let's get all the folders, and then let's get the folder admins as the second HTTP operation. And then additionally, we have the third and fourth. When I attempted this, I ran into an issue where no accounts were returned. And so it took a little bit of research to sit down and say, okay, why is that? And that's where I realized that the one point that I brought up on the web service slide is that all of the accounts need to be returned from that initial HTTP operation in order for them to be pulled in. So I had to think of a way to manage this and still bring in the accounts. So that led me to this. So this is how I solved that problem. I start off with the first HTTP operation, and I do the get folders. So that's going to go out. It's going to bring back all the folders. And then I added a web service after operation rule to the source. And in that rule, I actually go out and I make the call for each folder that was returned and get the admins. Once I get the admin data for each folder, I process it and add the users from that admin list to another map that gets returned back to the system as part of that initial call. So as you can see here, we go out, come back to the web service after operation rule. It makes the calls that it needs to build the user list, and then the user list gets returned back to the system. From there, I can go on and make those subsequent calls if necessary to get additional data about the user. So, where would you encounter data like this? Where we encountered it was a system that was based off of folders. Each folder had admins, and the admins had their own permissions within the folder. You could have a system that is set up based on groups, where the groups have the members of them and their permissions, or just the members. It doesn't have to have any additional data, but if that's what gets you to the user, that's what you're looking for. In another case that we had, the administrators were stored differently. So there was a user endpoint, but that brought back all 150,000 users, but the system only had 300 admins that we were really interested in. So we had to go through a couple other endpoints to get just those admin users for that system. So going on from there, how would you start when you encounter this? You've determined that, okay, this system needs to start from something other than the user objects. So first thing I did, and I recommend, is to start with figuring out what are the steps or the API calls that you need to make to get from your starting point to your user objects. That's going to tell you, how much, how complex your web service after operation rule is going to be, and where you need to look to see which data you need to pull out from each of those steps to be able to get your user object as the final return value. You need to determine the initial call. We talked about that already. That is where you say, okay, this is how I'm going to get there. You can then look at the calls and decide, maybe some of those calls that you think are part of the flow may actually be considered secondary operations. And what I mean by secondary operations are they are operations that get you data that you need, but doesn't necessarily need to be done to get you to the initial user. So if it's a folder and folder admins, and there's an endpoint to get folder details, you may not need that in your user process. That could be a secondary operation that's added to another HTTP operation later. And the last thing that needs to be determined is what attributes do you need to pull back into the system? And so this is going to be roughly the schema for the user accounts. So by using the web service after operation rule to build your users, you are bypassing the response map that is set up on the web service operation. So you need to build the response values that are going to be coming back from your web service after operation rule. So you need to just define which attributes need to be pulled back from that. All right, so I'm going to show some of this. So let's kind of go over. First, I'm going to show just roughly what the user-centric configuration would look like. And then I'm going to bring up the non-user-centric that I've set up. And I'll go over how I've configured the initial HTTP response for that. And then we'll go look at the code for the web service after operation rule to see how that came about. And then lastly, we will jump back into ISC and I will aggregate the data so that we can see how the data gets pulled back in and how it will look when you have it. And if there's time, I'll do the same thing for the entitlements. So you can see there's a little bit of a nuance, but you can do the same thing for entitlements as well. All right, let's get on to the demo. So if I Okay, so I'm going to start over here in ISC. I've gone to my sources. The first thing I'm going to do is come down here to my standard web service. It brings you up to the accounts. You can see I've pulled in some accounts here. But what we're interested in is the HTTP operations. So as you can see here, I start my account aggregation with a user aggregation. And then I've added a second operation here. So this is one of those secondary operations. We're going to give it the parent of this first aggregation. And now when we do the aggregation, it's going to do the first call to bring in all the users. And then for each of the users, it's going to make that second call to bring in the additional data for them. So that's how the standard process in a user-centric source is handled. If we jump over to my pre-configured HTTP operation, what you can see here, I haven't added any secondary operations for this, but we can see that we have the same initial account aggregation, except this is going to be for folders. If we go in and take a look at this, we can see that we hit the folders endpoint. And if we come up to the response mapping, you can see here that I've only added 4 attributes, and they don't map to attributes that you would expect for a user schema. The reason for this is these are attributes that I need to use in the web service after operation rule that come from these folders. And this allows me to get that data quicker than if I'm going through and processing just the raw response that we get back from the first web service call. All right. So let's jump over and look at the rule. All right. Most of you who have played around with the web service direct connector have probably encountered the documentation for the rule. It's got a example there, very primitive. What I have here is the rule that's based on a template that I put together. So I just stripped out some of the stuff from the rule in the documentation, and I added a couple items that help me when I'm setting up these rules. So we can skip past the imports. So the first thing you'll notice here, I've set up some variables. Couple things to point out here is the updated map info. This is the object that is going to get returned from the rule, and this is described in the documentation. I have added this final admin list. This is going to be used to build the users that I will then add to the updated map info and pass back to the HTTP operation. There's a user folder map here. What this is going to do is, because a user can be in multiple folders at a time, I will use this to store a map of user to list of folders that they're part of. And this allows me to then, at the end of this rule, take that data, plug it into an attribute on the user that's getting returned, and in the system, if I set that to multi-valued, it'll return each of those values in the multi-valued list. The other couple things here, the app base URL, we get that to make the web service calls. The app name is here because I was designing this to be usable for multiple sources of the same type. So the goal at the end was to have a rule that I could just pass in the application name, and it could be used on multiple sources of the same type. And then it was mentioned last year during DevDays that for these after operation rules, it's really good to add a unique label so that when you're debugging these, you have something to search for to see what logs are coming from your rule. So I've added that here. Going down from there and leading from this log label, I create my own log functions. So these are just shortcuts to get the data. And you can see here that I start with the label, I add the app name, and then I add the message that I'm passing in. So this helps standardize the output that I get from the system rather than putting this information in each of the logs, because I might forget to add it to a log if I'm in the middle of debugging. If I use this, it's always going to be added. And the last primary function here is going to be this log input variables. Again, this is for your initial setup and also for debugging, and this is just going to print out the variables that come into this rule from the system. So you can then go into your logs if you're just starting, and you can see what you're working with to help build this process. We do have another function here. I'm going to skip that for now, and we're going to come down here to the start of the rule. So down here, the first part of the rule, I'm going to log the inputs. When I move this to production, I will comment out or remove this line. But for Sandbox, I leave it in because it's good to have when I'm going through the development process. So if I see data that doesn't look correct to me, I have something that I can go back and say, oh no, this did come into the system from the source, and it is not an error that was introduced during my processing. All right. So the first thing we do, I mentioned before that we added those 4 folder variables to the response map. Those actually get added to the processed response object list, and we can go through that now, and we have each of the folders, and we have the details that we're really interested in. So first I check to see if it's null, and then I come down here and I loop through it. As I loop through it, I pull out each folder object from the map, and then I pull out the 4 pieces of information, and you'll see that they are the same from the response map with the same IDs. And then now that I have the folder, I can do the processing to get the admins, and I do that through this process folder function. So I process the folder and I send in the details. So let's jump up to the meat and potatoes of this. So here is the process folder function. We pass in our variables. First thing I do is log that we're entering it. When I'm doing development for these rules, if I'm going to use a while loop, I will put a runaway counter in it. This is just a good practice to keep the system from getting in an infinite loop if I make a mistake in the loop counter processing. And then I build the initial URL to make the call out to get my admin. So in this case, it's the base URL that we showed earlier. I'm going to hit the folders endpoint. I'm going to give the folder name because for this web service, that's how we're identifying the folders. And then we're going to hit the admins endpoint. In this case, there are also some paging variables here. I do want to point out at this time that when you are using the web service after operation rule to get data, you will need to handle the paging yourself. So just take that into account. And how you do that is really up to you. When I put this together, I just had a separate function that built the new URL. So that's why I've got the while loop here. So while our next base URL is valid, we're going to go in, we're going to configure our REST client, and we're just going to pull some of the data off of the endpoint that we're using and set up our REST client and configure it. From there, we're going to execute the call out to get our data and bring it back. It's going to come back as a string. We're going to get the headers. This is usually useful for doing paging. The header usually contains the information for that. And then we're going to parse our data out into a JSON object. So for that JSON object, we're going to parse that. In our case, they're going to be the folder admins. And within that, we're going to pull the data off for each of the admins we encounter. So we get the ID and the username. And I have a check here, has users. So where this comes into play is down here, we're going to jump into that user folder map. So if the user is in the map, that means we've encountered them already. So we're just going to add the folder to their list, and we're going to mark the has user as true because we've seen them already. If we haven't seen the user, we're going to create the list for them. We're going to add the folder to that list, and then we're going to put the user and the map into the list. And we'll see where this gets used at the end. But this is how we first tell if we have the user, and we keep the folder list for them. We do some logging, and then down here is where we use that has users button variable. So if they don't have a user already, we need to create that admin user. So it's just a map for the user. So we create the map. We add the ID, the username, first name, last name. These are those attributes that I talked about earlier that you need to decide what you need to put in and return here so you can process the users. So we put our information in. I've commented out the folder details because we could have multiple folders for these users, so that's not necessary here. But if it was a one-to-one relationship and there weren't any, you could easily do it just directly adding those here. And once we have our new admin user, we add them to this final admin list. And we continue to loop, first through all the users in the folder, and then we'll drop back out to that list that we had before and loop through each of the folders. I did mention paging. So when you're handling the paging yourself, you would come down here, and here you would calculate if you have any new pages of data to process, and then you would update the URL with that data that you needed. This can be configurable. You might need data, or you might need a URL. You might have to pass it in the headers, but just know that you have to configure it. So now we've processed the folder. We go through our for loop here. We process all of the folders. And when we're done with that, we drop down out of the loop, and we come to where we use the user folder map. So what we're going to do here is we're going to loop through our final admin list and check to see if they have a variable inside this map. Because we're pulling them from the folders, every user should have an entry into the map. So we're going to then take that entry that they found, so we're going to get it by their ID, and we're going to put it into the admin folder list. And this is an account attribute that we've set up to be multi-valued in the schema. When we're done with that, we're going to take the final admin list. We're going to add it as the data element to the updated map info. And this is that object that's going to get returned back to the web service HTTP operation. Last step, we return it. So now that we have gone over the rule, let's see how it pulls into ISC. So back here, we can first take a quick look at our schema. You can see we have the folder admin list marked as multi-valued. We take a quick look down here. We don't have any accounts. So we're going to jump up here and start our aggregation. So it's aggregating our users now. And we can see, okay, we've got 9 accounts that came back. We've completed successfully. So if we pop over to our accounts, you can see we now have accounts in the system. And this was built through the folders. Right now, we only have 1 user that correlated, but let's take a look at that user. So we pop in here. We can see that we've got their name, the ID, or native identity is the GUID. And then down here, here's the data that we pulled in from the REST endpoint. And as you can see, we have hit have the folder list. It's added there. Each of the folders that this user is part of is displayed there. So that is how you can bring in this data into the system and get to these user objects when you're starting from a non-user-centric source. Additionally, if you're going to do this for entitlements, it runs the exact same process. You would come in, you would configure your HTTP operation. If we look at that, you can see it starts from the same folders endpoint in our case. And you would go through, you would configure your web service after operation rule for this HTTP operation to pull back the data that you need. And then once you have the data and have everything configured, you can go ahead and aggregate the information in. And once that is done, you will end up with your information. In my case for entitlements, I wanted to have the folder name - role name as the entitlement. So in my web service after operation rule, I build those values to use and set them as the entitlement name and entitlement ID. So if we take a quick look at this, you can see the data that I pulled in from this. And you can see I built a role description from the folder description and entitlement description from the role and folder descriptions. And I built the IDs and the folder names with the dash in between. So that is how you can use the web service after operation rule to handle non-user-centric sources in your system.